So it seems to me that there's much wrong. I mean, I could speak about the commercial character of global education and the effects thereof. I could speak about the fact that there is a recognition that diversity, a higher education system with a diverse set of mandates is important. And the management of higher educations doesn't sufficiently recognize that, except in places like Finland or Germany, etc. And I could speak about that. But I think that the most fundamental challenge of our time is that all of our substantive challenges have a transnational character, whether it's pandemics or whether it's climate change or whether it's inequality or whether it's social and political polarization. And actually, to resolve those challenges, you're going to need institutional capacity and human capabilities around the world. You're going to need them in as much as the Philippines or Australia or South Africa or Brazil as you have them in New York or London or Paris or Berlin or Beijing. And in a sense, that institutional capacity is being repeatedly weakened in significant parts of the world. Not all. So China has transformed itself in the last 15, 20 years. So has Singapore. There's some significant capacity in Australia and how that's built over the last 30 years. But overall, in many parts of the developing world, those institutional capacities are being eroded. And they're being eroded by the very nature of the global academy and the structures of partnerships of the global academy. The way it works is basically you offer scholarships largely provided by governments to their universities. You then offer those scholarships to talented people around the world. They come to study, and then effectively they don't go back. Now, this is not malevolent by any means. It's when people who come for higher education come in a particular life cycle. They come in their 20s and 30s. But yet in their 20s and 30s is precisely the period in life when they develop relationships, partnerships. They have children. So this is not malevolent. It's not like you can come with the best of intentions. The net effect is the nature of life, the way it's structured, creates a circumstance where the brain drain is enabled rather than disabled. And so what you do is you lose people in large numbers. And as you lose talented people in large numbers, you begin to erode institutional capacities. Now, there are some countries that can sustain this. So if you take India with I don't know what's it, Bharat now, 1.4, 1.5 billion. And if you take China, you can sustain it because you've got scale in a major way. Even then it has an impact. But if you take places that are much smaller, South Africa, 50 million, and many parts of the African continent, many parts of other societies, you don't have scale. And so it has a much more dramatic impact on institutional capacities. And as you have institutional capacities, it creates a problem. Now, any research will tell you that if you want to think through how to do climate change, or how to shift from a transition for fossil fuels, or how to develop apps, the trick is you require global science and technology, world class, but you also have local knowledge. So how you structure a city map in San Francisco is fundamentally different to how you structure a city map in Nairobi, simply because of the spatial structure of Nairobi. It operates in a different environment, its cultural milieu. Naming of streets doesn't work in exactly the same way. You have shanty towns, all of these kinds of things lend itself to a very, very different app design. And what you then need is not the global science is not necessary, but it's the linking of global science and local knowledge. And what the global education system at the moment does is it undermines that. I'll say one final thing and move to the next question. The statistical or the limited statistical indicator suggests that this is a serious problem. We know anecdotally it's a serious problem. So other than Singapore, And a couple of places like post-2007 China, the statistical indicator said you're losing large amounts of people. India, the numbers suggest that you're losing more than 80%. This is numbers that I didn't do. The Carleton University did a study on brain drains, and they did it for the African Union. Much of this I picked up through that conference. Suggests that in the main, there's a dramatic effect that you're losing more than 80%. India was clearly the numbers that they had, but they're doing it via data of people coming into Canada, the United States, Britain, etc., and then tracking people through a particular methodology. So there's no data on Africa, but I would say that I think it would be worse than India, just anecdotally. And so I think you've got a serious challenge that at the very moment, we need institutional capacity globally. You're weakening those very institutions and human capabilities. So what I mean by institutional capacity is that you don't enable the kinds of skilled personnel required to deliver on major public services. So when you undermine institutional capacity, the net effect in the hospital system is you just don't have enough doctors, or you don't have enough nurses. It could mean that you don't have enough engineers to manage engineering companies. It means you would not have enough well-trained civil servants to manage public services from local to regional to national government in a way that allows it to be successful, to deliver on basic services like water and electricity, etc. It means that you don't have enough teachers and academics to train new generations of skilled personnel. So when I speak about institutional capacity, I'm really literally speaking about the kinds of professionals required to run modern economies and modern societies through either public institutions like hospitals, schools, universities, governmental departments, or private facilities like private companies, businesses, manufacturing industries, IT companies, startups, etc., etc., etc. This is why, if you take a place like South Africa, which I know well, you have both a brain drain, you have both a skills deficit and an unemployment crisis. It's not that you don't have jobs. You just have the people not trained for the jobs that are available. And so at the same time as you got 60% unemployment of young people, you just have a major skills crisis because the one doesn't match up with the other. Not all Western countries, but in the main, if you're looking at the United States, you're looking at the UK, you're looking effectively at Australia, and frankly, a number of other West European countries. There's a massive cross-subsidization. Think about this. In my university, it will cost you about 21,000, 22,000 if you're an international student. It costs you about 9,000 if you're a domestic student. There is no way British higher education could survive if suddenly foreign students dried up. In fact, I would argue 90% of the universities would be declared bankrupt overnight. And we are looking at, when I'm talking about these fees, I'm talking about pounds, British pounds. So when you're looking at a South African cost structure in rands, you're looking at effectively a 500,000 rand fee. That's before you're even looking in accommodation and related costs and subsistence, etc. So there's no doubt British, American, Australian higher education. I remember a couple of years ago, I looked at the balance sheets of Melbourne University. Something like 50% of their income was coming alone from Chinese students at one stage. If that simply dried up as a result of a political act, now that might have changed over the last few years, But these institutions are incredibly vulnerable. And ask yourself why students come in. So in some senses, they're much better and stronger universities, there's no doubt. But in another sense, you'll often have students leave a much stronger university in South Africa or Brazil and come to a weaker university in the UK. Why would they do that? Well, they come because what they want is the British badge, because the British badge accesses the British economy, or it gives you access to the global economy. And what you've done is you replicate the very inequality of the global this thing. So there's a massive problem here. And frankly, I've said this in the UK, so I'm not saying anything new. There's nothing that I would say that it's not in the interest of British higher education. It's unsustainable, and sooner or later, it's going to throw them into a crisis. If you speak to most vice chancellors, and if you speak to most government officials, they'll tell you this is a crazy situation. But government politicians are so driven by short-term agendas. And frankly, vice chancellors are so driven by the balance sheet and how the balance sheet looks. So even somebody like me, for all of my big talk, Bharat, I'm giving you all of this stuff. What happens in the end of the day? I still charge 3 times institutional. I write about it. I say it's wrong. But at the end of the day, I still charge it because I'd wipe out 50% of my budget, my income stream. And so what I'm trying to do is slowly launch new programs that slowly wean us off this over multiple years. But in the short term, frankly, it's almost impossible if you're a vice chancellor to swing out of this. And that system conditioning is what has become the fundamental challenge. Now, system conditionings can be unraveled, but they're often only unraveled by governments. When somebody makes, like Thatcher did, and fundamentally shifted the system by reorienting the foundations, you're going to need somebody with the capacity to do so. Now, I'm not looking at this as zero-sum games. You can also make shifts over periods of time. And we shouldn't see this as one or the other. But we do need a dramatic rethink of global higher education, and particularly Western higher education, because it's unsustainable, it's bad for their countries, and it's accelerating the global economy and weakening capacities globally. And it's going to destroy our abilities to respond as a human species across the planet to many of the transnational challenges of our time. The answer to this is, it depends what lens you're asking. If you're asking me in my lens as the vice chancellor or the director of SOAS, a commercial model is the only viable given the existing systemic constraints. Absolutely right. If you're asking the question, is this good for the global community, for you to address pandemics, climate change, etc., I'm saying we're acting in the short-term interest and compromising our long-term future. I'm saying this to colleagues here. I'm saying this to colleagues in South Africa. I'm saying this to colleagues in the long term. If your horizon, your time horizon is 10, 15 years, yeah, by all means get away with it. If your time horizon is the next 100 years, I'm saying we're setting the global community up for failure 2 generations down the line. By the way, that's the debate on climate change, right? Climate change is, we're not going to all drown tomorrow, but we are on the verge of drowning the world in 100 years. This is why I think that there's a push and a pull. Now, the question you've got to ask yourselves, how is it that we didn't lose them 40 years ago or 30 years ago? That there was a much more equal sharing. We assume that this is natural today because all of what we're thinking about is today's experience. But 40 years ago, this wasn't a natural experience. You lost some, you didn't lose everybody, and there was a much greater mobility and equalization flow from one to the other. It is now, given the way we've structured it, it's the very globalization of the global economy without globalizing and addressing the equitable structures of that global economy. It is about globalizing in an unequal manner that has created these perverse consequences. And so what I'm saying, in this globalized, perverse globalization, you have to concretely and consciously build mechanisms to think about solutions, to think about correcting for the unequal these things. And so for me, that's the way to do it. So about 3 weeks ago, the European Union and the African Union came together. And they basically they had a summit in which they decided to put resources in getting European and African universities to work together in joint research centers, in joint PhD training, where you share staff, you co-curriculate and you co-credential. Now, the reason that emerged is because the Guild of European Universities and the African Research Universities Alliance have been lobbying around this for 2 to 3 years. So here's a major shift that is underway from the Europeans. Now, of course, they're doing it for their own agendas and they have their own purposes. But they're beginning to recognize that the existing model doesn't work. And it seems to me that what we've got to start thinking through is innovating around this model that the Europeans and the Africans are starting to explore in a particular way. How do we do it on a more substantive basis? So if you ask me, there is enough. This doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. At the moment, we're still bringing lots of people coming in to the UK and the US. And the 20,000, 25,000, that's still going to come in, partly because the elites are paying for it from the developing world. There's lots of enrichment happening in those parts of the world, and they can afford it. But you're not getting to scale. There's hundreds of thousands of people who still can't be trained at the appropriate level, and we don't have enough educational capacity and institutions there. But if we brought global and local together in a series of very innovative partnerships, networking, in creating networks of institutions, and if you could co-credential and co-teach, you could create and reach a much wider scale. And slowly you won't stop the brain drain, but you'll mitigate its worst consequences. You'll begin to address it because you'll be training more, and then you'll be creating the enabling conditions for people to move. Because ultimately what the question you have implicitly there is, people leave because there's no opportunities. But as opportunities develop, people begin to go back. And we've seen multiple examples of that. It would mean recognizing that you can't structure your partnerships at an individual level. You have to seriously think at an institutional level. That means co-teaching, co-curriculating, and co-credentialing. It means hosting research centers that are jointly owned by northern and southern partners in the developing world, where masters and PhD students from both sides, can actually have internships, can locate themselves at, etc. By the way, some of this already exists. And it exists mainly in public health. If you go into, where do you think they set Ebola research centers? They don't set it up in London. They set it up in West Africa. Where do you think they set up HIV/AIDS research centers? In South Africa, not in London. Where do you think they will set up research centers on dengue fever? They don't set it up here. So in higher education, public health, they do this all the time. Why is it that we don't do that in the social sciences, the commercial sciences, and in parts of the humanities? So here's the thing, right? Look at how quickly the globe responded to effectively the pandemic. And the largest producer of vaccines is coming from India, not from the West. Now that happened because of an intervention, if you like, by higher education, by the Indian government over multiple years and private sector over multiple years, going back 20 years now, to build a vaccine capacity in India. South Africa, ironically, had a vaccine capacity in the early 1990s under apartheid. We let that erode because we saw that simply as a commercial enterprise. And ironically, post-apartheid South Africa let the vaccine capacity go. India produced that vaccine, and now South Africa is forced to catch up and is now looking up. Now, India had capacity and training, and so enabled that development to happen. It seems to me similar kinds in military technologies. You have seen a much greater, look at how we enable the trade in uranium. It's a fundamentally different market to the normal commercial markets. So, and why? Because you're too worried that uranium would land up in the wrong hands. So the question is, why can't we reimagine global higher education as a public good that requires public capacity, training and skills around the world? Because you can't address climate change in the middle of Guinea-Bissau unless you have skilled people there working out a set of technological and public policy solutions that will allow you to address that problem. So for me, I think that there's a whole series of examples there. And it seems to be basically the entire purpose of the exercise is how to make some extra cash. You've got an inequality and you're manipulating the inequality so that you can, if you like, pad your balance sheet. That's not the purpose of it. So I would much prefer that Western institutions work with local institutions, manage and develop co-teaching, co-programs selectively initially, and then more broadly. And you begin to broaden the suite of programs on offer, and you create more permeable boundaries. It's also worth noting that the technological revolution enables this on a fundamental new scale, because what you can put on the table in a most significant way is blended education. So you could literally say to big classes, instead of having 1,000 people in a class now, I will do all of the lectures online, and we will have the tutorials in face-to-face arrangements. And those tutorials can take place in Delhi, they can take place in Johannesburg, and they take place in Bloomsbury and Melbourne simultaneously, based on the same lecture that is provided globally to all 4 or 5 of those students. The online capacities in a kind of blended way. The problem with the debate on online is people are talking about it as if, can we replace face-to-face with online? That's not the purpose. The logic of universities is not simply what you learn in the classroom. It's the ability to engage with people across racial, religious, gender backgrounds. You meet people, you make relationships, etc. That's what it does. And you learn through peer learning. And it seems to me that's what we need to think about. The final thing I would say is what I said to Soros's team, the Open Society. It seems to me philanthropists should be using the limited money they have to broker these arrangements, as opposed to trying to replace higher education. And that's not happening. Could Soros encourage the European Union and the African Union to go on scale? Could they encourage the UK to do the same? Could they get the Americans to do the same? That's more, use your money as a lever to broker new relationships. That's how I would see it.